I'm Dr. Casey Griffiths, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Dr. Casey Griffiths back on the show. He's a BYU professor in charge of church history and doctrine at BYU. And so we'll talk about his latest book, 50 More Relics of the Restoration. We're going to get into some really fun objects here, including James Strang's Sceptre and the cricket team called the Islamabad Moronis. That was definitely an interesting story. You won't want to miss it. Check it out. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have a return visitor back on the show. Could you go ahead and tell us who you are?
Hi, I'm Casey Griffiths. I work at BYU, and I'm excited to be back too. It's always a pleasure to visit.
And you've got a new title now. I know you're the new president of the John Whitmer Historical Association.
I am.
For 2023.
For 2023.
Tell us about that.
I love the John Whitmer Historical Association. It's a smaller historical association. It kind of it is the community of Christ what the Mormon History Association is to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And yet over the last couple of years, it's kind of morphed into less of an emphasis on community of Christ and more of a sort of, diverse restoration movements. So you can go to John Whitmer and it's a little bit smaller. It's a little bit cozier. You'll hear some really, really good research. And you'll also hear a lot of diverse restoration perspectives. So for instance, our 50th anniversary conference was just back in September. And we had a healthy contingent of Strangite scholars that were there. And you don't hear very much about James Strang because there's not very many adherents to his branch of the restoration anymore. And meantime, the Joseph Smith photograph was the main
big deal
session. Yeah, John Whitmer Journal published the first real write-up on that photograph, the first pictures of it, and so it's just a real grab bag. And I love MHA, and I've always had a positive experience there. But like I said, I think I like John Whitmer a little bit better, not just because I'm the president, but because it's a little bit smaller and a little more,
a lot more diverse.
Yeah, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, you get a lot more restoration groups there.
Yeah, and that's lively fun, right?
I've even found that there are more Gospel Tangents listeners at John Whitmer than even Mormon history.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to use the term, but John Whitmer is a real great home for oddballs that are a little bit, maybe, I wouldn't say off the beaten path, because there's some great mainstream scholarship that's presented there too. I mean, Richard Bushman was our keynote speaker a couple of years ago, but also it feels like the perspectives are really diverse, and we're talking about the whole restoration family. Right. That seems to be what sets apart John Whitmer. Where MHA, there's a lot of diverse opinions, but it's primarily discussions that surround the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, yeah, I enjoyed John Whitmer quite a bit. For our 50th anniversary, I got to meet with all the founders and interview them. And
because that's like Bill Russell. He was one of the
Bill
founders.
Russell's one of the founders.
Who are some of the other founders? Bill's the only one I really know.
The main guy, it seems like the George Washington, the indispensable man, is Richard Howard.
Oh.
Who's still with us. He and his wife, Barbara, who are remarkable. If you've heard the name Richard Howard, it's because he is to the community of Christ what Leonard Arrington was to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And those two actually know each other quite well. And Richard Howard is the one that starts to say to community of Christ, let's be a little less defensive.
Right.
Let's be a little bit more open. He's the person that invites scholars from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to come and see the Joseph Smith translation manuscripts and verify them. He kind of introduces really gently members of his church to the idea that Joseph Smith may have practiced plural marriage and using a more disciplined, rigorous, less defensive methodology when it comes to history. And his daughter-in-law is Deborah Winger, if that helps too.
Like from Footloose?
Yeah. Well, was she in Footloose?
I think so.
Terms of endearment, legal eagles, all that stuff. Oh, yeah, I was over visiting at his house, and
that's his daughter-in-law?
That's his daughter-in-law.
No way.
Yeah, his son is Arliss Howard, who's actually a fairly well-known actor in his own right. So I'm in Dick and Barbara's home, and I saw a picture of their family, and I was like, your daughter-in-law looks just like Deborah Winger. And He said, she is Deborah Winger. And so after that, I mean, I don't know if I'm a huge Deborah Winger fan. I guess I know her enough to recognize her, but that was kind of a weird connection to Hollywood and restoration history.
So she hasn't converted the Community of Christ?
I don't think she has, and I don't know if Arliss is active either. They shared a couple Arliss stories, but Dick Howard was the person that gathered together all these Community of Christ historians and said, we need to have something like the MHA. So the organization's really linked. John Whitmer's founded 5 years after MHA is founded. They founded theirs because Leonard Ariing invited all those guys, Paul Edwards and Bill Russell and Dick Howard, to come and attend MHA. And they wanted an equivalent for Community of Christ. And as Community of Christ has grown and changed, like I said, it seems like John Whitmer has just kind of naturally turned into this. Here's where every branch of the restoration can meet and feel comfy. And it's like a weird family reunion where, you'll have the Strangites, you'll have people from Community of Christ. A lot of their conferences are held every third year. Their constitution says they have to meet in Independence. And so a lot of the Independence churches come out and meet. And it's a great place to hear some really unique perspectives on the restoration. It's a very, very enjoyable conference. So I'm proud to be the president of the JWHA. I don't know why they picked me, but I really, really treasure my associations that I've had there.
Yeah, it's super fun. Where's it going to be next year?
Next year, it is going to be in Texas.
Fredericksburg.
Fredericksburg, Texas. So Mel Johnson, have you had Mel on this
I
before?
have had, yeah.
Mel's a son of a gun, right? He's a great guy.
Yeah.
Mel is kind of the leading Lyman White scholar
in
the church and in the restoration, I should say. And he has been twisting everybody's arm to go to the Whiteite settlements in Texas. So we're going to Fredericksburg.
Yeah.
There's actually a ton of interesting stuff in Fredericksburg.
It's near San Antonio, for those of you who don't know.
It's near San Antonio. There's a museum about the Pacific War there and a lot of interesting things. And it's kind of off the beaten path. Like, I can say that Zodiac, Texas, where the Whiteites had their settlement, is a place I've never been to before.
Yeah.
And so I'm really looking forward to it.
Me too. It was supposed to be there a few years, and then COVID killed everything.
Yeah, it was supposed to be in St. George, which was a big thing for them to do it in Utah. I don't know if they ever have before. They have done it in St. George one time, a long time ago.
Oh.
But now it's planned for Texas next year and then St. George after that, because the conference in St. George was canceled due to COVID.
Right.
It was moved online.
Yeah.
So, like I said, they bounce from place to place and visit a lot of really unique places, and it's a fun group of people to be affiliated with.
I have to tell you a funny story, a couple funny stories, but there was a guy that I ate breakfast with that was investigating the LDS church, and he was at John Whitmer, and I'm like, what? You come to this? And then he told me that after I said I had a podcast, he's like, oh, I recognize you.
Well, you kind of attract the oddballs too, Nick. So he's probably familiar with all the oddballs out there, and I wouldn't say John Whitmer's a bad introduction. Maybe if you're trying to join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it might be hard to jump. That's jumping into the deep end of the pool.
Well, they had a 70s disc, everybody was supposed to dress.
Yeah, they had a 70s day, and
there was an Elvis there.
And I should mention too that the whole conference took place in the Community of Christ Temple, which when I tell my students, we're going to have a 70s day and play disco music in the temple, they just think, what the heck is going on?
Right.
This religion, but in Community of Christ, they use their temple as kind of a multi-purpose facility. It's not as designated as our temples are. And so we had a delightful time.
Yeah, it was
and a
fun. Great
experience, and temple staff was just wonderful to work with. So nothing but good to say.
And then there was another presentation. Kyle Bashir's, do you know Kyle?
Yeah, he's one of the Strang guys.
Right. And so I was like, are you a professor or whatever? And do you tell us his background?
Kyle is, I think he's a Pentecostal, isn't he? Or a Baptist?
I thought he was Baptist, yeah.
Yeah, he's a Baptist minister.
Right.
Who just wrote his master's thesis on James Strang. And let me tell you, there's no bottom to the well when it comes to James Strang. There's just a lot to process there. And I ate lunch with Kyle, and I called them the Strangite community, even though half of them aren't affiliated with anything having to do with the restoration. They just think James Strang is really fascinating.
Well, yeah, because he talked about because James Strang was a polygamist, and I'm trying to remember if he talked about, was it Elvira? Was that the cross-dressing wife, or
what was the name of the cross-dressing wife? Just the phrase "cross-dressing wife" tells you how
exactly
strange this is.
But because there was a presentation on, and maybe they're the same person or different. But two of James Strang's wives, one was named Elvira, and I can't remember if that was the one that was cross-dressing as Charles Thompson.
Yes,
his nephew,
Charlie
claiming
Thompson
to be his nephew.
Yeah, another one, and I guess this will tell you how strange John Whitmer could be, but one of the keynotes was Amy DeRogatis, who's not a member of any restoration movement, but who's a scholar on this daguerreotype, that one of James Strang's first plural wife originally, dressed as a man, and
right.
So it was on cross-dressing in the 19th century, and that kind of shows you what a typical weekend is with John Whitmer, where you can go from here's a Joseph Smith photograph to here's a photograph of James Strang's wife dressed as a man. And like I said, for me, it's really fun.
I love it.
It's not general conference for sure, but the diversity of the presentations, and I got a chance to, I took the Strangite community on a tour of the temple lot. To show them around, and it was really fun to be with Vicky Speak, who's written a great book on James Strang, and Amy and Kyle, who were all really interested to kind of get back to, this is where Strang was coming from. This is Joseph Smith and the temple lot, and then Strang comes onto the scene a lot later. So,
was Bill Shepard on that tour?
No, Bill's a little bit older guy, and I think he just kind of declined.
Yeah.
We were just happy Bill made it to the conference, because for a long time, we didn't know if he was going to come because he's getting up there.
Right.
But Bill, for those, have you interviewed Bill?
I've had Bill on, yeah.
Yeah, Bill's...
In fact, I had him on at Whitmer when it was in New York, in Rochester.
Yeah. Bill is a really admirable guy, because he is a Strangite that, isn't... he's not a scholar, he's a believer. He believes in James Strang and his revelations.
I think he's a scholar. He's written a lot of stuff.
Yeah, you're right. It's not fair to say he's not a scholar.
He's not a trained
but
scholar.
He's not just in it for the academic side of things.
Right.
Which some of these other figures are. Bill's a scholar and a believer. And, at the conference, I came up and asked him about Strang's revelations, which are hard to come by. Bill was part of publishing James Strang's revelations, and just said, hey, I'd really like a copy. And a couple days after the conference, he had mailed me a personal copy that actually had his own notes.
Oh, nice.
Inside of it, which was so nice of him. So I really admire Bill and like the Strangites.
He is one of the kindest people I've ever met.
Yeah, he's really, really good guy. And he's a John Whitmer stalwart, too. So.
Yeah. So, since we're talking about James Strang, you have a new book out that has James Strang's Sceptre in it.
Yes, I do. And I should give you a little bit of background on this book. So, last time you interviewed me was for my book, 50 Relics of the Restoration.
Correct.
And I think in the course of that interview, I told you that it was actually 100, because we wrote the book, my partner and I, Mary Jane Woodger, based on this series of books that have no connection except they're the history of something in 100 objects. So it started with the British Museum that published the history of the world in 100 objects. And now there's a history of America in 100 objects that's published by the Smithsonian, and a history of baseball in 100 objects, and a history of World War I in 100 objects. And we just said it would be really fun to do a history of the church in 100 objects. So we wrote the manuscript, and then we had some trouble publishing it. And our publisher, who we really love, they've been great to work with, basically said, 100's really ambitious, so why don't we do 50 and see if it works out? So they published 50 Relics of the Restoration, and it went really well.
Yeah.
The book turned out really well, and I think it's done okay. And so the whole time we were saying, hey, there's 50 more relics with essays already written and edited, and the photographs ready to go. And so it's been a really quick turnaround. 50 Relics came out last November. Now 50 more is coming out this year. And we didn't tell them which ones to pick. They just made up the list themselves. And we said, okay, we're just happy to be here, basically. But because of that, 50 Relics kind of covered the early restoration Joseph Smith. This is what you would expect people to know about. And since Oddballs is turning into a theme of this. 50 More Relics is sort of the deep cuts. Like, this is the weird stuff that our publisher, Cedar Fort, may have felt. I don't know if people will know about that, but I'm just thrilled to see this in print, because the stuff that's in this book, just because of the way the two books were edited, is demonstrably further off the beaten path and a little bit strange. And yes, James Strang's Sceptre is one of those objects too that I really, really was devastated when it wasn't going to be in the first volume, and now I'm thrilled that somebody somewhere is going to have a book on their shelf that has a photograph of Strang's Sceptre. So you've had some great Strang scholars on here, and most people familiar with your podcast will know that Strang is one of the leaders of this really prominent breakoff movement. In fact, you could argue that Strang's movement sort of collapses, then reorganizes, and becomes the reorganized church. There's just so many people in the RLDS community of Christ Church that have their beginnings with Strang and then become disillusioned and reform around William Marks and Jason Briggs and finally Joseph Smith III. But Strang is an oddball. You know, he shows up in Nauvoo after Joseph Smith's death, claims that he has a letter from Joseph Smith designating him as his true successor. He's only been a convert of, I think, 5 months at this point. And the 12 refute the letter and excommunicate him. But Strang starts to really appeal to people, and for a number of reasons. He's claiming that angels are speaking to him. He's claiming new revelation. He has the Vori plates, which he translates, which that's what Bill Shepard sent to me, was a copy of the Vori plates, which are really fascinating themselves. And I think it's fair to say that at least an early part of his appeal was he did not practice plural marriage, or claimed not to.
Right.
Now he does.
Well, at first he didn't. He rejected polygamy, and then he had a revelation. I don't think it was in the Vori plates, because he's had a few books of scripture. Was it the Book of the Law of the Lord where he...
I think so. Now, I could be wrong. Bill Shepard would be better to answer this than me, but he does get a revelation that he is supposed to start practicing plural marriage, and he does so in kind of a interesting way, where his second plural wife starts traveling around with him dressed as a man. And
as his nephew.
And this was, like I said, a big part of the discussion at John Whitmer's. There's a daguerreotype of her dressed as Charlie, whatever.
Oh, was it Thompson?
Charlie Thompson.
I don't remember.
Eventually, he goes public with his practice of plural marriage, takes several more wives, moves to Beaver Island. And at Beaver Island, a ceremony is performed where he is crowned king of the kingdom of God. Now, this scepter, which is currently in the Historical Library of Community of Christ, we believe is the scepter that he was given, because the whole ceremony is really dramatic, and there's plenty of sources to read about it. A guy named George A. Adams, who is a whole other story. Like, we've got to do a discussion on George Adams. Basically has this big theatrical ceremony where Strang has a paper crown of stars placed on his head and a wooden scepter placed in his hand. So the object itself is very humble looking. Like, if you saw it, you would just think that it's kind of a lacquered, nice...
Almost looks like a bat.
Yeah. It's smaller than a baseball bat, and I'll let you get the book and see the picture, because we got a photograph of it.
Yeah.
Community of Christ was very gracious in saying, yeah, take this and take a photograph of it. In fact, it was hard for me to get the photo because Locke McKay, an apostle in Community of Christ, loves the scepter too. And he had a couple times I came to photograph the scepter, and Locke had it in Nauvoo because he loves to, show it off as well. It's really a cool relic.
Right.
But it was in Independence, and I took a picture, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's well crafted. It's not especially ornate or anything like that. It's just kind of smooth wood. When you look at it, it's about the size, I guess, a scepter would be. And I would guess that, adherence...
About 4 or 5 feet tall, is it that?
No. It's about, I don't know, maybe a foot and a half.
Oh, it's tiny.
It's tiny, yeah. It's just something you'd kind of hold in your hand like this. And for some reason, the first couple times I saw it, was wrapped up in aluminum foil, too, which adds to the weirdness factor as well, right? But Strang took that as, His calling is King of the Kingdom of God, which is built primarily on Beaver Island. That's another place we've been begging to go to for John Whitmer. But everybody that's been to Beaver Island has basically said it's really hard to get there, and the facilities on the island are limited when you get there.
Well, I was talking to Locke, and he said don't take the ferry, take a plane. But is there a way to get there by plane?
You can fly there. Beaver Island's a little island in Lake Michigan.
Or like a Cessna or something? Or
apparently you can charter flights to go there. The ferry apparently takes about 2 hours and is pretty choppy and can be a little harrowing from what I hear. This is what I talked about with the Strangite.
Because I want to go there. I haven't been there.
I'd love to go there too. In fact, if you're ever going, let me know.
Okay.
I would go too.
We'll plan a trip together.
I'm just flat out interested. And Beaver Island has a poignant history too. Like, honestly, Strang's an easy target for people to ridicule.
Well, and because there was a book, in fact, I asked Kyle Bashirs about this.
Yeah.
There's a book called The King of Confidence.
Yes.
Written by a reporter, and he kind of makes fun of James Strang.
He really satirizes James Strang. And I talked to the Strangite community about that book too, because I saw it.
They don't like it.
It's a national publication. The guy that wrote it isn't super well known, but sort of well known. And I just asked them, what was your feeling? Because I read the book. And all the Strangite scholars, these are serious people like Amy Derogatis and Vicky Speak and Kyle Bashirs basically said, you know what, it's not respectful.
Right.
Like, he writes it as kind of a, frontier, it's almost a satire of those 19th century novels where they have like big bold titles with a lot of exclamation points in which James Strang does this and this and this and things like that. And I'm not a member of the Strangite faith, but at the same time too, I've seen people handle early members of our church like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young in the same kind of sarcastic way.
Right.
And you can just kind of recognize a document that's written in bad faith.
Right.
That's written.
That's
more,
what Kyle said.
Yeah, it's written more to mock James Strang than it is to explore genuinely. I think Vicky Speak's book is superior.
Right. Yeah.
Personally, and like I said, Strang, when it comes down to it, there's more than meets the eye there too. Like, the surface story is this hilarious tale of a guy who, dresses his wife up as his nephew. But there's some also interesting points in Strang's theology. Strang has a really robust theology that embraces environmentalism, that talks about the beauty of the earth, and has some meaningful passages in his scripture that have been meaningful to me in my life. And Strang's eventually murdered by his own followers. Other people have told this story better than me. And then his followers were literally swept off of Beaver Island. It's almost a Jackson County, Missouri type narrative,
right,
for the Strangites themselves. And that type of religious persecution is something that shouldn't be made light of. And I'm not saying that the author of The King of Confidence, whose name escapes me, was sarcastic about that part.
Right.
The general tone of the book was that James Strang was a con man.
Right.
The King of Confidence is the name of the book. Right? And there's a lengthy passage in there expositing what a con man is and where that title comes from. And that's clear, that's his thesis. Well, people believed in James Strang. And I personally think the jury's out on James Strang's sincerity. Like, did James Strang believe what James Strang was teaching? I sort of think he did. And the bottom line is, people suffered, horrendous persecutions that I feel were unwarranted. And I can recognize in their community the type of suffering that my community has endured. Right. And so I didn't put the Sceptre in to be disrespectful. I put it in because I wish more Latter-day Saints knew the story of James Strang and what an interesting figure he was, and that concept of kingship, which is found in our faith too. Joseph Smith was crowned king of the kingdom of God. He didn't do it as splashy and dramatic as Strang did, but he did do it in Nauvoo, and apparently, so was John Taylor and a couple other people in our faith. So that was something I was really, really excited.
And remind people what the official name of the Strangite church is.
What is the official name of the church? I put it in the book.
You don't know?
Well,
It's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
that's right. That's right.
It's a capital D
Capital
instead
D.
of a lowercase d like
That's
ours.
another
They
thing
have
with these
no dash.
with these restoration groups is the dash small lowercase d is a big deal with them too. In working with Community of Christ, I got corrected a lot of times before I finally picked up on it that Latter Day with a capital D is a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wrote another book with some scholars from Community of Christ. We had to have, it sounded almost pedantic, but in the book they wanted to use Latter Day lowercase d and Latter Day uppercase d to distinguish between the two communities. And that is, I think we're one of the only communities that use the dash lowercase d.
Yeah, I think we are the only one. Yeah.
And that's right, the Strangite Church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter capital D Saints.
Yeah, I was talking to Patrick McKay just recently, and one of the things was he said to me, "Do you know how many churches of Jesus Christ there are?" And I'm like, "I do." the Cutlerite Church, the Bickertonite Church, and you know, now President Nelson has said, "Well, you can call us the Church of Jesus Christ," and that's now our official website address. We don't have a "the" in front of it. The Bickertonites do. So we got to distinguish better, especially amongst the restoration groups. You can't just say the Church of Jesus Christ. People don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, the first time I went to Independence, I introduced myself, and hey, I work at BYU, and someone said, "You're a Brighamite."
There you go.
And I remember being, a little offended, like, well, yeah, Brigham Young was a member of my church. But I don't like to use that term. And then I realized, I've been using terms like Strangite and Bickertonite and Josephite, which Community of Christ, follows. And at a certain point, we got comfortable, just saying that. I have a lot of friends in different restoration movements, and I think most of them are okay with being called the Bickertonite, but there's still a little twinge, just like I have a little twinge when I'm called a Brighamite.
Yeah.
Because, we want to identify with Jesus Christ. I think that's common across all the restoration movements. And so we try to use respectful language. But I will say the Strangites are the least fussy of anybody that I run into. If you call them a Strangite, they usually just go, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
They like James Strang.
Well, they like to be called Mormons, too.
And they don't mind being called Mormons, which that's a whole other, can of worms. Bickertonites hate being called Mormons and saying they're part of the Mormon faith. And I don't think that members of Community of Christ are particularly fond of the term.
No, they don't like it.
Mormon either. And some people are more or less comfortable with it. And I've even had someone, say, are you guys dropping the Book of Mormon because President Nelson asked us to use the name of the church instead of the word Mormon? So it's a mixed bag in the restoration family of all those terms. And boy, it's a fun culture to be part of, but you have to do a lot of listening.
Right.
In order to understand where people are coming from.
Definitely. So what else is in 50 More Relics of the Restoration book?
Okay, well,
like to talk about?
I can do some broad ones. For instance, a sunstone from the Nauvoo Temple is in here. For this one, the biggest dilemma we had was choosing which sunstone to use. There's a sunstone in the Visitor Center in Nauvoo. Most people that have been to Nauvoo are familiar with that sunstone. It's officially owned by the state of Illinois, but it's on loan and is displayed inside the Visitor Center behind a glass case. But the one
LDS Visitor Center.
The Latter-day Saint Visitor Center in Nauvoo. But the one we wanted a picture of is the one in the Smithsonian. So there's one in the Smithsonian in the Museum of American History. And apparently it is one of the crown jewels of their collection. Like, the people we talked to were really thrilled that they were able to acquire a sunstone. And since they acquired it in the 1970s, it's been on display prominently. It's on the first floor of the building. You walk in, and there, bam, is the sunstone right on display. And they also have right next to it a few coins. I think that's in this. No, I think that went into the first book where there were coins minted in the Utah Territory that have some really interesting symbolism on them.
And for people who don't remember the sunstone, it was actually part of the Nauvoo Temple.
Sunstone was part of the Nauvoo Temple. As we were researching this, we tried to get into, why moons, sun, and stars? Because most members of our church walk up to the Nauvoo Temple and see the moonstones, which are at the base of the building, and then the sunstones, which are at the top of the pilasters, and then the starstones, which are above them. and just sort of assume, well, this is about the 3 degrees of glory. But I mean, if that's the case, it should go stars, moon, sun.
Right.
And it doesn't. The best source we could find was one of the foremen on the Nauvoo temple, who said that the symbolism of the Nauvoo temple was derived from the imagery in the book of Revelation, from Revelation 12 specifically, where John sees a woman. Joseph Smith translation designates that the woman is the church and says that her feet were adorned with the light of the moon and the light of the sun shone in her face, and she had a crown of stars on her head, which I don't think anybody would have guessed, right?
No.
If we hadn't had that source, and that they were using the Nauvoo temple to architecturally express the ideals of the Church of God as the bride of Jesus Christ, which to me is really, really fascinating. And in the chapter, we got into a little bit about, it was sort of our gateway to explain Nauvoo temple symbolism. For instance, the inverted pentagrams on the Nauvoo temple. A lot of people walk up and say, well, that's satanic.
Right.
Why are there satanic symbols on your temple? We got to trace that back a little bit and found out that in the 1840s, nobody would have seen an inverted pentagram as being satanic. For the saints in Nauvoo, it was a morning star. It was an emblem of the planet Venus, which is the brightest star before the sun rises. It was a Christ symbol for them. And a pentagram itself, which, today is associated with satanic worship, was also, in some sources, linked to the 5 wounds Jesus received on the cross. And so they saw these symbols as a link to the atonement of Jesus Christ, and as ways of linking themselves as the Church of God. The other interesting explanation I read, and I can't recall the source on this, but it was compelling, was that the arrangement of the moon, sun, and stars on the Nauvoo temple was because of cosmology. That if you're standing on Earth and you look up into the sky, the nearest celestial object you see is the moon. And then the next nearest object is the sun, and the most distant is the stars. And so the order on the Nauvoo temple of moon, sun, and stars is supposed to basically communicate this is a square model of the universe. This is a place of orientation. This is a place where you can come and figure out where you're at. And I think that ties into a couple symbols on the Salt Lake Temple. Like you may have noticed that the Big Dipper is carved into the west tower of the Salt Lake Temple, which there's varied explanations for, but I think the most common one is the same thing, that the Big Dipper is carved there because it's a symbol of orientation. You find the Big Dipper, you can find Polaris. If you find Polaris, the North Star, you can navigate. If you go to the temple, you can find Christ. If you find Christ, you can navigate your life and the trials that you have. So we were excited. We had to get permission from the Smithsonian to put this one in. But we were happy that, not every object in the book came from a random collector 402, which there's a lot that do that, but this is the Smithsonian Institution, which...
I noticed there were quite a few private collectors, and it didn't really say who it was from.
Yeah, and part of that was us running into... We had a lot of people, once we started working on the book, that came out of the woodwork and said, hey, I have something really cool. Come look at it. A lot of them, we had to do a lot of provenance research to make sure that what they were showing us was real. And a couple times we had to turn people down because we couldn't find good provenance for the things that they did. So we were really, really careful with that. And we also worked in coordination with the Church History Museum, who does a lot of provenance research too. So if we got something, we generally send it to them and say, what do you guys think? And then we go back and get the story from the person and work through it there. But that did lead us, these private collectors, to some really, really cool things. For instance, one private collector, who I'll mention by name, Reed Moon. Have you interviewed Reed Moon?
I have not.
Oh man, you need to sit down with Reed. Oh,
sure.
Reed is so fun to talk to. Reed has this store in Provo called Moon's Rare Books, but really it's like Reed's little closet of curiosities. And Reed is he's an avid scholar of Latter-day Saint history, but he's also a huge fan of movies and a huge fan of, all this stuff. So he's got a Harry Potter room where he has, a copy of Harry Potter signed by Daniel Radcliffe.
Oh.
And in the next room, he's got the bowl that they use in the Hunger Games to pull the names out of. He's got I don't know if some of the stuff he has, I don't know if I can say on this podcast that he has, but I'll tell you privately after. But Reed has a set of scriptures. Reed has spent time trying to collect a set of scriptures from every president of the church.
Oh, wow.
And so the set that he gave us to put in this book was the set of scriptures that we believe Joseph F. Smith owned when he received Section 138 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So it's a little tiny set, like they're about the size of those military book copies of the Book of Mormon. But if you open it up, write in Joseph F. Smith's handwriting, purchased this day. It's got a clear provenance going back to Joseph F. Smith. And then the passages that he highlights in Section 138 in 1 Peter and 2 Peter are highlighted within the book themselves too. And so there's apparently another Bible that the family donated to the church too that could possibly be the book he's studying. But there's a good possibility these little tiny set of scriptures are the scriptures Joseph F. Smith was reading the day that he has the vision of the spirit world and the people within the spirit world. And in researching that, we actually found out a lot about the context of that vision. That was one where we had to do a lot more work because it doesn't show up on the Joseph Smith paper site. It's not a Joseph Smith revelation. But when you start to dig into that, man, there was so much interesting stuff happening when Joseph F. Smith cracks open his scriptures. I think it's commonly known that one of the things that drove him to read the scriptures was that his son died. His son Hiram M. Smith, who's this very, very gifted, he's an apostle, he's a scholar. Hiram, his son, writes the first real serious commentary on the Doctrine and Covenants, that little red-bound one that a lot of people have. Hiram dies suddenly of appendicitis. And Joseph F. is devastated by this. But the part of the story that we sometimes miss is that it's just about, I think, 6 months later in September when Ida Smith, this is Hiram's wife, dies. And so Joseph F. Smith is not only dealing with the loss of his son, he is dealing with his grandkids being orphaned. And the loss of his son and his son-in-law so close in proximity. And the realization that, 6 of his grandkids are orphans is one of the things that sort of drives him into this. I think he was in a state of extended depression when he has the vision. Like there's some sources that say he barely came out of his room the last few weeks of his life. And the other thing that
he died from the Spanish flu too. That didn't help, right?
Well, I don't know if he dies from the Spanish flu. He dies less than 30 days after the revelation is given. And one of the misunderstandings too is that I used to, tell the story in my classes that he got up and shared the revelation with the general conference. He didn't. He attended the general conference, and there's sources that say people were shocked when they saw his appearance, that he looked like a person who was on death's door. But the statement he makes at general conference isn't the revelation. It just alludes to it. So what happens is he gets up at the general conference and says, I know that many of you haven't seen me recently, but I've been alone and I haven't been alone too. He says, I've not been alone these past 5 months. And he talks about how the Lord had spoken to him, but he doesn't give the revelation there. Apparently, after the conference was over, he pulls in Joseph Fielding Smith, this is the future president of the church,
right,
and says,
his son,
his surviving son, I guess you'd say. He has 2 kids that are apostles. He's doing pretty good in that department. But he pulls in Joseph Fielding Smith and says, I need you to write this down for me. And so Joseph Fielding Smith pulls out a typewriter and types it out as Joseph F. Smith dictates it to him. And one of the cool things you can do in association with this, and we didn't even know about this when we were writing the book, is the church renovated the Beehive House where this revelation was received. And they made part of the Beehive House resemble what it was like when Brigham Young was there, but they took a special suite of rooms and arranged it the way it would have been when Joseph F. was there. Because the revelation, apparently the vision happened in the Beehive House.
Oh, wow.
And they've got the room set up there with furniture that belonged to Joseph F. and a nice big portrait.
Did he live in the Beehive House?
He lived in the Beehive House.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know
and
that. Because now it's a restaurant, right?
You're thinking of the Lion House.
Oh, sorry.
The Lion House is a restaurant. The Beehive House is still sort of a historic site, but it's kind of one of those ones that everybody goes to Temple Square, but they never go to the Lion House and they get scones or something like that. But the Beehive House is right next door, and this is actually one of the coolest stories of the restoration, where this guy, let's contextualize a little bit here. The First World War has just ended, the most devastating war in the history of mankind. I mean, back in 2020, when everybody was saying this is the end of the world, man, in 1918, you had a lot better case for it being the end of the world than 2020. World War I ends, and the end of the war sees the first truly global pandemic, the Spanish flu, which does happen to overlap with Joseph F's death. I don't think he died of Spanish flu.
I'd always heard that he died.
He was in advanced age. I don't think that was the cause of death, but they didn't hold a public funeral for him because they were worried about the spread of the flu. So, and one thing we haven't been able to figure out is, did Joseph F. say anything about the flu? Like, was he seeing this as a portent of the end times as well? But I mean, you've got a major war, first war that really Latter-day Saints participated in. American War.
Because we didn't participate in the Civil War.
We really didn't, and the Spanish-American War was over so fast, we just really didn't have a chance to participate either. But in World War I, a regiment of Latter-day Saint troops is sent. B.H. Roberts is, appointed as their chaplain. And I mean, all you have to do is drive around to any random town in Utah, and there's usually a World War I monument where a lot of these doughboys that left this town got killed. And you've got to imagine this prophet who, has it weighing on him heavily that Latter-day Saints are being killed in large numbers in an American war. And also that his own son and daughter-in-law died. It has that on his shoulders. And this vision of the spirit world, I think, was very much to comfort him. The last time I read through it, one thing that struck me is it's the last appearance of Adam and Eve in the scriptural canon. The first two spirits he lists as welcoming Christ into the spirit world are Adam and Eve and many of her glorious daughters. And that just struck me as, hey, it's nice to know that mom and dad are still together. All these years later in the spirit world, welcoming people in. And so Reed Moon has those scriptures, and he is also super generous. He's got this big vault that just has all this amazing stuff in it. He's got a Book of Mormon that belonged to Samuel H. Smith, the very first missionary in the church.
Oh, wow.
He's got Samuel H. Smith's Doctrine and Covenants. So I recommend anybody that's interested. And Reed's super generous. Like, he's like a kid in a candy shop whenever he brings out his stuff.
On. I've had Kurt Bench on, and we got to get Reed on.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Reed's collection is fun, and like Reed will go off on anything from Star Wars to the Hunger Games. But it feels like church history is his real love.
Yeah.
And one of the items we wanted to put in the book, but was semi-controversial, is Reed also believes that he knows people that have the Book of Mormon that Hiram Smith had in Carthage jail.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so Elder Holland held up one in General Conference, most people will remember. That's the one in the church history library, and that could be the one. But there's several, actually, that can be traced back to Hiram Smith and have that page folded down just like they describe in section 135. And Reed has traced this one to a family of descendants from Hiram Smith. And so he feels like it's the right one too. And I don't think he has it as a store, but every time we go there, he's got something crazy. Wolverine's claws or Indiana Jones's whip. And
oh, really?
Yeah, like I said, Reed's just a fun guy. And he was incredibly generous in this book. But then the question became, are we going to get in trouble for feeling like we're promoting Reed or Brent Ashworth, who's also
I was going to
really
ask if
generous
Brent
with us?
Ashworth had anything in
Yeah,
that.
Brent Ashworth.
Did you leave those both as private collectors? Or?
So we put them as private collectors.
Okay.
And it was partially because we wondered about the ethics of, promoting someone's business in the book. And it was kind of gut-wrenching because I'm fine promoting their businesses. They've just been incredibly generous to us.
Right.
It was just that ethical question. Because Brent gave us some top-notch stuff too. Like one of the items in the book is a little book it's like one of those books where you get people's signatures, right? And you open it up and there's a poem in there from Eliza R. Snow. Oh. Eliza R. Snow wrote a poem to this little girl named May Pearl Richards, who her grandpa was Franklin D. Richards, the apostle in the 19th century. And her father was killed in a carriage accident. And so this little girl's devastated. She's just 8 or 9 years old. And there's this page where Eliza R. Snow wrote out a poem to her about how much her dad loved her and how he was still watching over her. And nobody knew that it existed until Brent Ashworth, who has got to be well known by this point. He's in the Murder Among the Mormons documentary.
And we've had him on the podcast.
You've had him on the podcast, and he's a fascinating guy. Like, that guy's a real raconteur. He knows how to tell stories. He acquired this book, and in the book was the poem. And he acquired it in time for them to put it in the collected poems of Eliza R. Snow. So it's there, but it really isn't something anybody was aware of, that Eliza didn't write for anybody, for the public, or it seems like she ever intended to publish. She was just really great. And so she wrote a poem for this little girl. It was almost 150 years later that the poem was discovered. And so private collectors like that were a real asset to us. Of course, the two biggest groups we worked with were the Church History Museum, who were incredible to work with, and Community of Christ, who were also really, really generous to us in putting this book together. So people from the Church History Museum, for instance, just actually went through, and they have so much stuff, they picked out things and said, hey, have you heard about this? Here's grain flakes, metal, which was in the first book.
Yeah, that was in the first book.
This one has, the item we'd put in this book is the Joseph William Billy Johnson's radio. They pulled this out of storage for us.
He's from Africa.
Yes.
He was one of the first church members in Africa.
Yeah.
Was it Nigeria?
Yeah, he's in where was it? No, it's Ghana. He's in Ghana. Joseph William Billy Johnson, most people are maybe familiar with that seminary video where they show the guy in Africa, and it's a 1990s seminary video.
Yeah, that sounds too new to me.
That came with the New Testament media package, but...
I actually wrote a short biography of him that's
Did you really?
on blackpast.org. So.
Yeah, okay. So he is one of the early converts to the church in Africa, and converts before the 1978 revelation. And this CES video that highlights him tells his story where, he had been trying to just hold this branch together because there were some serious accusations of racism made against the church.
Yeah.
He was a believer in the Book of Mormon. He is tired. One day he gets this prompting when he comes home that he needs to just flip on his radio. And he turns on the radio and he tunes into the BBC, and he heard the announcement that President Kimball had received the revelation that the priesthood could be extended to all worthy men. And this is that radio that he tuned in on.
Oh, nice.
So people around my age, who went to seminary in the 1990s, there was a video put with the New Testament to go with Acts 9, where Peter receives the revelation that the gospel can go to all people, where they show Joseph William Billy Johnson coming home. And that's, by the way, his name, Joseph William Billy Johnson. I think the Billy's in parentheses. We just said Billy Johnson's radio. He came home and he tuned in and he heard this. And he's one of the very first people ordained to the priesthood of African descent. I think he's the first patriarch of African descent. And he's passed away now. But, when you start tracing the history of the church, specifically in Eastern Africa and around those areas, Nigeria and Ghana, his name pops up all the time. In fact, we had several artifacts associated with him because I just like him so much. And that's why the radio didn't make it into the first volume, because he also had a statue of the angel Moroni on top of his church that they had sculpted from that old light blue copy of the Book of Mormon.
Oh, yeah.
That was on top of their church before, any missionaries had reached them. They knew about the church, and
because they were asking for missionaries from President McKay.
Yeah. These are Billy Johnson was one of those people that wrote to David O. McKay and said, "I've read the Book of Mormon. I love the Book of Mormon. Can you send missionaries to teach us the gospel?" And David O. McKay had to basically reply and say, "We're not going to send missionaries right now." They actually, it's a more complicated story than that, because they do send an investigatory mission. A mission president in Africa is sent up to
Nigeria
to kind of scout around and see what the possibilities are. And then the David O. McKay Diaries, which Harvard Heath just published, actually highlight the discussions among the members of the First Presidency in 12, where they're basically saying, should we send missionaries? And the discussion is, well, we can send missionaries, but can they organize an independent branch if they don't have independent priesthood? So can we just One of the topics of discussion that came up was, can we just give them the priest? Because President McKay was kind of on record as saying, I think it's a policy. He's the person that gets rid of the whole, not a single drop, where in a place like South Africa, people would have to trace their ancestry before they could get ordained a priest and prove they didn't have any black ancestors. President McKay comes along and ends that.
Right.
President McKay also on his world tour comes to Fiji. If you've ever been to Fiji, the people there, appear to be black Africans. Same features, same basic, skin color, but President McKay said they don't have ancestry that links to Africa, so we're not going to put the priesthood policy in here. So it seems like he was containing the priesthood policy, but he was also clear in saying, I haven't gotten a revelation on this. And the diaries indicate that they couldn't achieve unanimity among the Quorum of the 12 either.
See, I didn't know about this. I've been, I've had Matt Harris on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Matt's more well qualified than me to talk.
Yeah, he's coming out with a new book, and I cannot wait for it to come back. Because I've actually talked to Matt. I'm like, I need to have you back on. So we'll talk about him again when that book comes out. But I didn't know about this Harvard Heath book.
Yeah, Harvard Heath edited a collection of President McKay's diaries. And scholars have known about the McKay diaries for years. I used them a lot in my research because I read about
Prince
education.
Did as well, right?
Yeah, Greg Prince did too. What happened is if you look at a lot of the books produced by President McKay, it will say something like edited by Claire Middlemiss. Claire Middlemiss was President McKay's secretary, and she was really devoted to him. But Claire Middlemiss also kept a record she basically kept a copy of all of President McKay's diaries. And I mean, these aren't personal diaries, they're work diaries. They're the office diaries, basically, records of his meetings. And before Claire Middlemiss passed away, she donated those to the University of Utah. And so these records have been available at the University of Utah for scholars to use. Greg Prince uses it in his biography of David O. McKay, which is excellent, by the way. But Harvard Heath, who is another great scholar, comes along and edits the diaries and publishes them as signature books. And if you want to know about the priesthood policy in the 1950s, I was particularly interested in the fiscal policy of the 1960s because, we talked today about how the church is flush with resources, but there was a major financial crunch in the mid-1960s, and then Elda Tanner comes in and basically saves the day. These are all in Harvard Heath's edited volume of David O. McKay's diaries, which, like I said, is really, really fascinating stuff. And we used a lot of that research to kind of, contextualize the priesthood policy and what was going on in the 1960s, where it does seem like, President McKay may have been trying to systematically sort of stop the spread of the priesthood policy. And President McKay on several occasions says, I think it's policy. It's not doctrine, which was the big discussion at the time too. Is this doctrine or is this policy? Policy we can change.
1949 it was doctrine, and then 55 he said it was policy.
Yeah.
Just
so that the first presidency statement in 1949 says it's doctrine, and then President McKay sort of gently starts using the term policy to describe it. And it's not the time period when the revelation is changed or the revelation's received, but it does show you the context kind of leading them towards it. And like I said, Matt's done some really good research on that. But we wanted something from someone in the field, someone in Africa who's dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis. And, we also wanted a perspective where I'm a white guy, my co-author is a white woman. We wanted a perspective from a black person on what it was like to hear the revelation and to understand now that they can hold the priesthood. And so we didn't just put his story in here. We put a little bit from Marcus Martin.
Oh.
Yeah, his dad, Helvetio, was the very first black general authority in the history of the church. Marcus is also a great guy. He was the head of the religion department at BYU Hawaii for a while, and he talks about him and his dad both being ordained to the priesthood.
They're from Brazil, right?
They're from Brazil, yeah. They're black Brazilians. And so that was something we were super thrilled to include in the book too. And that was something that a person in the church history library, I didn't know it was there. He took me aside and said, I'd really like it if you could put this in. And I just can't thank them enough. Like the staff of the church history library was great too. Yeah, there's a couple items in the book, by the way, that are personal. Can I talk about them too?
Absolutely.
So a few things that, like I said, maybe verge on the weird. One's from my hometown, okay? and
Which is?
Delta, Utah. Delta, Utah.
They've got the best high school mascot in the state, I think.
The rabbits, yeah. On my town,
Who's scared of a rabbit, huh?
I've heard every joke that there is, Rick. You're not going to find a new one that I haven't heard before. But Delta rabbits, and Delta is a Latter-day Saint community in the West Desert of Utah. And I really wanted to include this one item, which, so on Main Street in Delta, there is this building. It's semi-abandoned. My mom bought the building next door, and she didn't buy it. She rented it and turned it into a reception center. You go upstairs, and in the second floor of the building, there is a 1920s and 1930s dance hall. That is the most eclectic, weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. So you're going up the stairs, and lining the walls are statues of the Angel Moroni. So you get up there, and there's these glass decorations all over the place designed to reflect light, and you can see like the bandstand where there's a band there playing hot swing music, and then the central feature is this 8-foot tall mirror ball.
8 feet.
8 feet tall. A mirror ball has a train around it and an airplane that circles with a sign that says "We dance next Saturday," and then on top is the Salt Lake Temple.
Oh, no way!
And then you start looking around the dance hall and you can see Moroni, and then there's a model of the Salt Lake Temple over on one of the walls. It was owned by this guy named Billy Van, who Billy Van, I sort of think was a member of the church. I don't know if he was active or not, but it's always been there, and I've always just thought, what the heck? Like, who would think to associate dance and swing music with the Salt Lake Temple?
Right.
Brigham
Young, maybe.
Brigham Young, maybe. What I actually found out was that there was this kind of unique subculture of dance halls in late 19th, early 20th century Latter-day Saints. Like, when you start tracking them down, there was one in just about every single town. Like in Manti, there was one in Palisades, a little lake outside of town where everybody goes to party. All that's left of that is the cement pad it was on. But there was a place where bands would come and they would do swing music. And in Salt Lake, there were dozens, and they were sometimes affiliated with word houses. Like, sometimes today we think that popular music and religion are sort of diametrically opposed to each other. But this was one place where, a symbol like the Salt Lake Temple did not feel weird in the middle of your hot swinging, jazz band dance performance or anything like that. And Delta, which is my hometown, I grew up, there were always rumors that there was some kind of weird dance hall that you couldn't get into. It probably has the best preserved Mormon dance hall.
And your mom preserved it?
And my mom helped preserve. Shout out to my mom.
Wow.
My mom set up a reception center downstairs, and part of it was upstairs was this dance hall. And she's worked really tirelessly to try and raise funding to preserve the dance hall and keep it the way it is, because it's like nothing you've ever seen. Honestly,
wow. Now it makes me want to go to Delta.
You need to come to Delta, and I'll take you to Van's Hall. And I'll show you the hall. And honestly, I took the MHA to Delta a couple of years ago, 2016. Really? Yeah, we went down to Eskdale and visited the House of Aaron and,
I wasn't part of
all that stuff. And the highlight of the tour was Van's Hall. Like, Tom Alexander, one of the preeminent historians of...
Is that on the way to Eskdale?
It's on the way to Eskdale. It's right on Main Street in Delta.
I don't remember going through that.
Tom Alexander, one of the most important Mormon historians of the last 50 years, ran to the mirror ball and started singing "My Way" by Frank Sinatra underneath the mirror ball. Everybody pulled out their cell phones and started filming them. So that was maybe me, but I wanted to highlight that aspect of Latter-day Saint culture that until...
Aren't you glad we didn't grow up Pentecostal? They can't dance.
Yeah. I mean, I know Footloose was filmed in Utah, but it feels like Utah, at least early Utah, was one place where popular music and religion weren't seen as opposing forces to each other. That you could walk into a dance hall that had a gigantic mirror ball with the Salt Lake Temple on top and not think twice about it.
I remember watching Footloose and being like, what? Who would ever band dancing? Like, that's just weird. I didn't realize the Pentecostals had it.
Yeah, when Kevin Bacon gets up and, reads the Bible to convince the town. Well, I mean, Latter-day Saints had their prophets advocating. They had Brigham Young's Revelation, section 136, told them, when thou art sad, dance, celebrate. It would have been awesome if Kevin Bacon had read section 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants to the town council.
It wouldn't have been as big of a hit.
It wouldn't have been a big a hit because the town council would have been like, oh, yeah, we know this.
We do have this big scandal with The Chosen right now.
Do we?
Yeah,
What's
apparently
the
Chosen quoted some Book of Mormon verse or something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's neither here nor there. The guys that make The Chosen are super nice. I know a couple of them. Yeah. It is weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
But this was one thing that kind of highlighted, an aspect of Mormon culture. And this is one case where I went in, climbed on a ladder, took the photograph myself. Maybe my ulterior motive was to publicize the dance hall to raise money. But I also think that in and of itself is genuinely fascinating. And as I started to research Latter-day Saint dance culture, I was surprised at what a rich tapestry it is, that just about every town in Utah had some kind of dance hall. And most of them have fallen into disrepair. This one's not in that great shape right now, to be honest with you, but it's still there, fully preserved. And it has to be seen to be believed. I mean, it's really... There's a smoking.
What?
I mean, Salt Lake Temple, Mirror Ball, over here is where you go to smoke if you need to smoke and things like that. And there's a hat room and...
Is this before we really started getting real serious with the Word of Wisdom?
No, I mean, this was post when we were serious with the Word of Wisdom. But I mean, I think
non-Mormons could gather.
It was a place where everybody could gather. And it wasn't... I don't know if... Like I said, I knew Billy Van's grandson. I went to school with Brian Vandy Vander was his name. I don't know if Billy Van was incredibly engaged in the church, but he saw it as a gathering space for all people. And the culture of Latter-day Saints, he celebrated. Like, he thought the architecture in the Salt Lake Temple was cool. He thought Moroni was a fun symbol. And I didn't get any feeling, because I went to the local town archive and dug up Billy Van's records. I didn't get any feeling that any of it was sarcastic or mocking of the church. Like, it was a genuine, sincere homage to Mormon architecture, which he thought was cool, and to his credit, did not think was a weird thing to place in a 1930s dance hall. So that's one thing to put in the book. Let me bring up a couple other things. One that's going to feel odd is a seawall stone from Moroni High School. So this is something that I saw that was incredibly moving to me. But I research education, and for the last couple of years, I've been getting grants to visit all of the church schools. And most people know about BYU and BYU. I don't know Hawaii, but there's a network of schools in the Pacific. Most of them are in Tonga. There's 2 schools in Fiji. There's a couple schools in Samoa, and there's one school in this country called Kiribati. And Kiribati is it's spelled Kiribati. Kiribati is...
It looks like Kiribati.
Kiribati, right? Yeah. Most people would know the name Tarawa. Tarawa is where one of the bloodiest battles in the Second World War was fought. It's this island, it's this set of atolls. They were originally called the Gilbert Islands. When they became autonomous, when they separated themselves from Great Britain, they gave themselves their own name, which is Kiribati. It's where the Battle of Tarawa was fought, which was one of the first real island hopping adventures where the Marines really hadn't worked out their methodology, and there were a couple things that were off the tide. The tides didn't work with the timing, and it just turned into one of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War. And when you go to Kiribati, you can still see a Sherman tank offshore from Tarawa, which Tarawa is it's about a 40-mile long string of islands. Red Beach is where the Marines invaded, and walking around Red Beach for 5 minutes, I found an M1 shell and a 50 caliber shell that had blown up. Over on the other side, there's these huge Japanese guns that are still there. And other than this battle that had been fought there, nobody knows very much about this country. But in the 1970s, the church established a presence there. What happened was a guy on the island had set up a school, and he wrote to Liahona High School and basically said, I've taught my students in elementary school, but I can't offer anything further than the government won't let me. There's only a handful of schools on the island, and education is very limited. So he wrote to Moroni High. He wrote to Liahona High in Tonga and said, can I have students come here? And so the church flew out and visited him, and then flew to Moroni and said, yeah, we'll let you send 12 students. So they send 12 students, all 12 of them get baptized the year they spend at Leona High. And to this point, missionaries hadn't been allowed into Kiribati because of the government there. Like, the government literally told the church, hey, we've got a Catholic church and we've got a Protestant church, so people can choose. So we really don't need another church, thanks. But now that there are members of the church that are natives of Kiribati, they can go back and serve missions. And they start serving missions. It's a little crazy because their supervision is limited, but they establish kind of a strong branch there. And then there's enough members that the church decides, let's build a school here. It's the last elementary school the church constructed in the 20th century. Now, the location of the school, they take over the school that the guy had been running, and they turn it into what's called Moroni High School, which is now one of the most important educational institutions in the entire country. Moroni High was built in this space where, I mean, the geography of Kiribati is unique. Most of the island, the widest point of the island is 800 meters. Most places you can stand in the ocean and throw a rock and it'll land in the ocean on the other side of the island. Moroni High is built in one of those spaces. And in order to create enough land for the high school, they had to go out and construct a seawall so that the land wouldn't be washed away. And it's sort of like once every 10 years, the students of Moroni High go out and rebuild the seawall.
Wow.
It's on the outer side of the island where the waves just sort of like crash up against it, especially at high tide. And this wall, I went to visit Kiribati, and I was walking along the wall, and I looked down and I saw this place where a bunch of students had written their names as part of their crew. They were the last group to rebuild the island. And I was so moved by it. Like, the idea that these students come out here and build a wall to hold back the ocean so that there's enough land for them to have a school to learn and to progress and to grow. And at the school, I mean, they teach religion classes and things like that. But the school sort of became the heart of the Latter-day Saint community on the island. Like, a lot of people that come to the school convert. And while I was there, I think there were 6 baptisms at the school. I was just there for a week.
Wow.
Visiting. And honestly, craziest conditions. Like, my house, they gave me a house to stay in, that's how generous they are, was right next to the seawall. And when high tide was there at night, like, you could feel the spray from the ocean, from the waves crashing up against the wall. And another weird phenomenon was you'd start walking down the road and you'd hear all these little like sounds behind you, and you'd look around and 300 crabs had come out of nowhere and were following you. It was really unsettling.
Wow.
The people were so sweet and humble. Like, when I went there, they had just gotten their first paved road that ran the entire length of the island. And everybody kept coming up to me and going, have you seen the road? And I was like, it's super nice. They're like, yeah, man, it's like really nice, right? Like, it's the best. And they were just super jazzed over the fact that they had a road with a sidewalk. At the same time, too, they were so generous. And here's the other part of the story. So this school gets set up, and again, still today, it's sort of the engine that drives the church in Kiribati. Over time, the population of the church in Kiribati grew until we're about 20% of the population.
Wow.
It's one of the highest percentages.
How many people are on the island, would you say?
The island probably has, don't quote me on this, but probably, I want to say, 40,000 people living on it.
Oh, wow.
And Kiribati itself, if you count ocean, is bigger than the United States. So the furthest island is Christmas Island, which isn't the one with all the crabs that everybody talks about. It's a different one, about 2,000 miles away. So if you go on a mission to Kiribati and they send you to Christmas Island, you'll be on a boat for, a couple days getting there. But Tarawa is where a lot of the population
So they don't have an airport?
They do have an airport, but flying into Tarawa is dicey. When you're landing, you're honestly going, hey, when does the land appear? Like, you're looking out your window and then all of a sudden the land's there and you land and you're okay. But man, they've built up a lot of that land, and we went there and we had to stay a week because when I went, there was only flights in and out on Monday. So we were forced to be there a week, which I didn't mind at all. The people were just super generous. I took a return missionary that had served there with me who knew the language and everything.
So they don't speak English there?
Well, they do speak English. English is the official language because it was a British colony. But it's kind of like Tonga, where, English is the official language, but sort of the common language of the people is their own language, which is Kiribati. That's the name of the language.
It begins with an I?
It begins with an I dash Kiribati.
Okay.
Kiribati. The other part of the story, and part of the reason why I wanted to go there, is the other mention you would hear of Kiribati besides the World War II battle is that it and Vanuatu are two of the most threatened nations from rising sea levels. So the widest point of Kiribati is 800 meters. The highest point on Tanuma is 8 meters. And I mean, you can go there and just ask them, like, are the sea levels rising? And yeah, like, we can see that they're rising. They're not in denial about it. The question is, what are they going to do about it? And as I talked to members of the church, I heard a lot of varied responses like, yeah, we may have to evacuate. To other people saying, God's not going to let our island sink. To people saying, we're going to fight this. We're going to plant mangrove trees, and we're going to reclaim the island, which they do occasionally. We're not going to go down without a fight, basically. But I mean, at the time I visited, which was 2018, the question was, will they ever get a temple? You know, they had to fly to Fiji. Kiribati is also one of the poorest countries on earth. Just that, it's this island. And they're super happy, and they're right at the perfect spot where the weather is 85 degrees the whole year round. When I was there, they were actually having a drought, which was surprising. And the other geographic feature of Kiribati, it's the country closest to the international date line. And so when I was there, I got up at 6 a.m. to take a picture of the sunrise, so I could say, hey, I'm probably the first person in the world to take a picture of the sunrise. But when I talked about a temple, because they had to save up to go to Fiji.
Which is how far away?
Fiji's about, I don't know, probably a 6-hour flight.
Wow.
From Kiribati. And the funny thing is we had to go to Fiji to go there. At our hotel in Fiji, the person that was running the hotel was like, so where are you gentlemen going next? Because I had my research assistant with me. And I said, we're going to Kiribati. And like, it looked like I set off a stink bomb. She was like, why would you go to Kiribati? Like, what is there? Well, Kiribati is gorgeous, first of all. It's got this turquoise lagoon and beautiful, beautiful island and friendly people, but it's poor. It's not a tourist destination because it's so remote, and that's part of the reason why the church has maintained a school there. I had some poignant conversations. The principal of the school was a stake president, and I said, do you think you'll ever get a temple? And he said, I just don't know. With the tenuous nature of our situation, with all the factors that are there, with just the simple fact of how hard it is to get stuff to this particular island. Like, sometimes if there's a bad storm, they don't get any groceries for a month or something like that. He just said, I don't know if we'll ever get a temple. We might have to. And going to the temple for them was a once in a lifetime.
Right.
You save up for years and years, and you go to Fiji, and you stay for a couple of days so you can get everything done you need to get done. They announced a temple at General Conference that's going to be built in Kiribati after my visit there.
Oh, wow.
And so the temple, this is an island where, like I said, just due to the geography, the president of Kiribati drives by 3 times a day. And the president of the country has had the missionaries over to his house, and Parliament is literally, this building that right off the road, because everything is less than 100 yards off the road. So, like I said, while I was there, the president drove by 3 times, and we were like, hey, what's going on? Everybody knows everybody. The location of the temple is going to be right across the street from Parliament. Oh, and wow. So imagine, like, in their world, imagine if the church had built the Washington, D.C. temple across the street from the U.S. Capitol. That's what's happening. And for the saints in Kiribati, it's just a huge blessing. And like I said, this little stone where they had cemented it in and then taken some of the spare cement and scratched their names into it was something that touched me a lot, but it's kind of an obscure story, so it didn't make it into the first volume of the book. Anyway, that was something that I really wanted to put in, and just the story of the global church I'm putting in there. But cool stuff.
That's cool. Have you worked with Devin Jensen? Because he's got a new book out on, I can't remember the name of it. It's something about war and the church, or I don't remember.
It's Battlefields to Temple Grounds.
There you go.
And it's going to come out in spring. And I wrote a chapter on Kiribati. So me and my research assistant, and actually, one of the first batches of students go to Liahona, there was a guy named JWHA Tune, who is now a member of the Quorum of the 70. And he is a co-author too. So Elder Tune was the one that showed us around the island and gave us the histories and everything like that. And man, it's into how the other half lives. Like, it's got this turquoise lagoon. And so with my research assistant, we did all our interviews and got our work done. And I said, let's go hop in the lagoon. And he had served there. And so I was saying, let's go party. And he was the one that kind of went, maybe let's don't. And I go, well, how come? Like, look at how beautiful it is. He goes, there are 40,000 people on this island, and there are no sewers on the island. And I just thought about that for a second and realized, oh. So if you have to go to the bathroom, and there's indoor plumbing at some facilities. Our house had indoor plumbing, but a lot of people just go down to the beach. And the next day when I woke up to go take my sunrise picture, there were several places on the beach where someone had just gone and done their business, and the implication was that the tide would sweep it back out. But for that reason, he said, for people that aren't from here, you can get sick if you go swimming. Now, the principal of the school was generous enough to take us out into the ocean. And once we got out there, we jumped off the boat and we swam around, and I got my play in. But it's one of these little faith communities where tons of Latter-day Saints there. They're incredibly faithful. They don't expect a lot. I mean, you'd go in and the house didn't have walls that you'd stop in. It had a roof and a freezer. And they just brought out, dish after dish and fed us and said, we're just so grateful that you guys want to hear our story.
Wow.
And come and listen to us. So I was grateful that got put in there too.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Casey Griffiths. In our next conversation, we're going to switch topics a little bit and talk a little bit more about church education. Casey's a little bit of an expert on that, and we'll talk about Joseph Merrill, an apostle who helped start the seminary program in the LDS Church.
To him,
Just wasn't an issue.
The physics were evidence enough for him that, if we came from evolution, who cares? That's how God created our bodies. Big deal.
Right.
And it feels like a lot of the solutions that he presented in the 1930s are the sort of things we could still use today to reconcile faith and science, to basically say, hey, do we really have to argue over how old the earth is, or, if humans evolved from lower orders of creation, when we've got this big, bright, beautiful universe to explore?
If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please become a paid subscriber at gospeltangents.com or patreon.com/gospeltangents. We've got full transcripts on our website at gospeltangents.com. And if you'd like to check out some of our other conversations, click over here. Thanks.